I'm Nettie Wiebe, National Farmers Union organic farmer here in Canada, where it is the deep winter at this moment. I want to give you, though, all of you, a warm welcome to this Disparity to Parity, Reclaiming Democratic Control Through Food Sovereignty webinar. These are extremely important questions, never more so than now. And the linkage between huge disparity, control over what we eat, what we grow, even the possibility of eating are very closely linked. And our subject of food sovereignty is the framework within which we are struggling with these questions. I introduced this webinar and want to hand it over to Liz Henderson to give us a bit of background on this series of webinars. Liz.
Thanks, Nettie. Hello, everybody. I'm an organic farmer too, and I've been a member of the Northeast Organic Farming Association and their representative to the Agricultural Justice Project. And my farm was one of the first community-supported agriculture farms in the United States. So while we can learn a lot from the old New Deal, both in terms of its strengths and also its failures, especially in regard to African-American farmers, we will have to design a new version for the 21st century. And that is what Disparity to Parity has set out to do. We've sent out a call to mandate fair pricing and update supply management to build a racially just, economically powered, and climate resilient food system. Headed up by the National Family Farm Coalition, this initiative includes farmers, both organic and conventional, the Federation of Southern Co-ops, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, Food and Water Watch, and researchers from several universities, united by a commitment to farmer, worker, land, food, and climate justice, racial equity, and well-being for all. The parity system that was set up under the New Deal established the Commodity Credit Corporation, the CCC, which made loans to farmers whenever prices offered by the food processors or grain corporations fell below the cost of production. And this allowed farmers to hold their crops off the market, eventually forcing prices back up. And once prices returned to their fair levels, farmers sold their crops and repaid the CCC with interest. By allowing farmers to control their marketing, the CCC loan program made it possible for them to receive a fair price from the marketplace without relying on subsidies. It also regulated farm production in order to balance supply with demand, thereby preventing surpluses. And since government storage of surpluses was expensive, this feature was critical to reducing government costs. And it created a national grain reserve to prevent consumer prices from skyrocketing in times of drought or other natural disasters. When prices rose above a predetermined level, grain was released from government reserves onto the market, driving prices back down to normal levels. So, next slide, please. Brad Wilson, who is a farmer and a constant campaigner for farmer justice, has done a great deal of economic research under the effect of the Farm Bill and pricing, and he has created this slide which demonstrates that while the subsidies, which are the dark blue, make up a little bit from what farmers lost when Congress departed from parity, the net result from farmers is the purple. So that is how much has been stolen from the people who actually do the work in farming by the big corporations who control the food system. So the moment has come to make big, unrealistic demands in the next Farm Bill. It's time to dismantle racism and end corporate domination with its policy of cheap food, financed by theft from the people who do the work. We have the opportunity of a lifetime to do this, to create a program for a just transition for agriculture with the social and policy changes that will lead to the vision that we share. So now I will turn the program back to Nettie, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that clear and unequivocal, very well structured discussion of what this is about and what the parity, what the meaning is of parity. I want to turn now to, we have here a very impressive and interesting group of speakers, so I won't take any more time, but introduce immediately Heather Retberg, who is a farmer at Quills End Farm in Penobscot, Maine, which she stewards together with her family. She's a leading advocate for food sovereignty in Maine and has co-authored and advocated for local ordinances to ensure food sovereignty and food freedom that have been adopted by 20% of Maine's municipalities, which is very impressive. She's co-authored and advocated for the passage of the Maine Food Sovereignty Act, which recognizes local control over food exchanges enacted by Maine's legislature in 2017. That's also a landmark. Together with Senator Craig Hickman, she co-authored Maine's constitutional amendment, now Article 25 of Maine's Declaration of Rights, enshrining food sovereignty, and that's the first state to do so. Additionally, she serves on the board of Food for Maine's Future and is the principal organizer of Local Food Rules, which promotes a revolution in thinking and action about who should control our local food systems. Heather.
Thank you, Nettie. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you all from Maine, where normally we would be joining Nettie in deep winter, but because of the sort of climate changes we're all experiencing, we have March-like spring weather here in Maine. My heart is pounding to be with all of you. It means that's my sign that something real is happening. This is a conversation that is so deeply far-reaching into many of our lives. In 2009 is where my advocacy began around food sovereignty without knowing we were engaging in that process necessarily. We had been feeding our community, our personal interaction with regulatory agencies and sort of the corporate hand behind them all came in 2009, and it emerged over chicken, what we call the pollo politico, the political chicken is where it all began here. We had been selling chickens directly from our farm to members of our community that had been legal under state law, and the state law was changing to make that no longer possible without an investment in infrastructure that was well beyond the scale of what we were doing on our farm. And then weeks after we had that interaction, the same inspector let us know that the sale of the fresh unprocessed milk from our farm directly to our community was also being reconsidered by the department, and that would not go through any kind of a legislative process. It was going to be administratively decided between departments of the government, and really came down to just calling us something different than we were, calling us milk distributors instead of farmers or producers, and by recategorizing us into a terminology that didn't fit what we were doing, then we would be subject to a whole nother level, again, of infrastructure requirements that were well beyond the scale of our farm. And so at that moment, in the fall of 2009, we began to see that we were really at risk of being sort of administratively disappeared from the landscape. And small scale farms, diversified farming was really growing in our area at the time, and in a way that felt very vibrant. And we just felt like we were recognizing that this is how farms get disappeared. And then when we disappear from the landscape, people don't understand what's happened, that maybe it's just a hard way to make a living, but that really there were policy barriers being erected that would just fundamentally erase what we were doing and what a lot of the burgeoning local food movement, if you will, was doing. So we went to our state capital and engaged in the regulatory and the legislative process around the chicken. We're essentially told that we did not have a voice at that table, that the legislature and the department hands were tied. They had to do things a certain way because of cooperative agreements with the federal government, and the administrative redefinition of what we were doing with milk was similarly beyond their control. It was a done deal, and there wasn't even a process to weigh in on. At that point, together with a couple of other farmers, a couple of other farm patrons and farm workers, we sat around my kitchen table. The idea came that we should go to the local level, and in the Northeast, we still have town meetings. So the people of the town are the legislative body that decides on matters local in nature. And we decided that this kind of community food exchange was local in nature. We needed to be able to define what we were doing if we were going to continue to exist, and if this food system that was a community-based model rather than a commodity vertical integration model, if it was going to survive, we were going to need to also decentralize the decision-making around our food system, our local food system, our community traditional foodways. So we were successful. To fast forward, in 2011, we drafted a local ordinance, consulting with 2 different legal foundations. We looked to our neighbors in Montville, who had been able to enact local laws to protect seed integrity, to Shapley and Newfield, who had protected their water resources from Nestle. So we had a template that was a rights-based ordinance instead of regulatory. And we really started thinking much more about food through the lens of rights. And so those first ordinances were successful in 4 out of the 5 towns in 2011. The legislature started paying attention. It would be 6 years before that Maine Food Sovereignty Act passed. And along the way, of course, the state was not going to recognize what the municipalities had done. But essentially, we were asserting an authority within our communities at the local level, based on home rule and our Constitution, that we could define ourselves, we could define our food exchanges, and that so long as it was between members in our community, a producer or a farmer to a farm patron, that that wasn't a place for state engagement. We learned from legal scholars along the way, in the similar way that Liz was talking about parity and scaling up by scaling out, so going horizontally, just like commodity farming is going this vertical integration of food, that we also would not be successful if we just tried to have vertical policy integration. It needed to diffuse horizontally first and spread from town to town across Maine and gain in strength. So thankfully that was able to happen. And by 2015, we had lost our food sovereignty battles in the state legislature. We were very discouraged. I had met Senator Craig Hickman in the governor's office in 2013. He's the one that put in the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. After we met in that office, he had run for office for similar reasons to what we had, why we were advocating at the local level, and said, I put in this bill, it's a concept bill called Maine Food Sovereignty. Do you have any ideas for language? So that was the beginning, but by 2015, we had lost that battle. And he called in the winter, that winter, and said, what if we go big? What we're being told that we have no right to choose how we feed ourselves, that there's no deeply rooted historical tradition of access to foods of all kinds. There's no right to our own bodily health. Let's put it in writing. Let's say that we do have the right. Let's aim for a constitutional resolution. And we were also motivated by that point of crossing this bridge between farming and the farming community, and also addressing hunger, and that these things in policy realms are always separate. So we were trying to put all of these things together in the Right to Food Amendment, and launched it first in 2015. And again, it would take 6 years for that to prevail through many different changes. But we lost that battle in 2015, and we came back to the Maine Food Sovereignty Act, again, just asking the state to recognize the authority of our communities to determine our own food system. And in 2017, that was enacted. And then we came back in 2019 again to enshrine a right to food, so that there would be access to food, and also this food freedom piece to the right to choose, the right to grow, the right to raise and harvest. But this larger grounding in the fundamentals of human rights, that every individual has a right to food in accessibility. Food should be adequate, it should be available, and it should be ecologically raised. So we were successful in getting that through the legislature with a 2/3 vote in 2021. And last November, the people of Maine voted to enshrine that in our Constitution. And I think I can leave it there. I'm at time, but certainly we can share the language of that article with everybody. We'd love to see it spread from sea to shining sea across the country, and see this as a right that is realized for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. What an amazing story of tenacity and determination and success. I'm sure we'll return with questions, but this is a very practical opening example of how one actually puts real legs under food sovereignty. So thank you. We move now to Onika Abram, who's the Executive Director of Farm School NYC. Onika, I think I'm not saying this right, but Onika Abram is an Executive Director of the Farm School NYC, is a parent, a partner, a farmer, and an educator committed to honoring the land and continuing its legacy for future generations, as her Black and Indigenous farming forebears did before her. She's a founding member of Black Urban Growers and Black Farmer Fund, and has served on the board of NESAWG and NOFA New York. Farm School NYC trains NYC residents in urban agriculture in order to build self-reliant communities and inspire positive local action around food access and social, economic, and racial justice issues. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Heather, I'm so inspired by the work that you've done, and so grateful to hear and learn from it. In so many ways, we hope to uplift and replicate some of the organizing strategies that you did in Maine here in New York State. I want to speak a little bit about the organization, which I'm so honored to lead, Farm School NYC, and then speak about some of the larger ecosystem work that we're doing in support of the farmers that we center. And for us, that means primarily Black, Indigenous, people of color, low-income folks, LGBTQI folks here in New York City. So they centered our school on social justice, really believing that farming and community can be a tool for liberation and self-determination for marginalized and poor people. And since 2010, Farm School's program have reached over 500 students, all adults who have gone on to cultivate regenerative farms and steward natural resources throughout our city and our state. So that looks like a number of different courses that we offer every single year. Everything from food justice, where we're really looking at the systemic issues that undergird the system that we want to change, to very tactical courses around drip irrigation and soil science and things like that. And again, our student body is really representative of BIPOC folks. So for us, about 75% of our student body are adult women, 15% are non-binary, are gender non-conforming, and vastly Black, Brown, and Indigenous, so including about 23% Latinx, 24% Black. Which really leads me to a sobering truth about the communities that we serve, and that's that according to the last Census of Agriculture, Black, Indigenous people of color in New York State make up just 1.3% of the producers of farmers in New York State, 1.3%. And I can vouch that the problem here is not lack of interest. Applications to farm schools programs have almost tripled in the last 3 years. It's increased like 95% since the pandemic. So we have to turn away about 5 applicants for every spot that we accept. And so when you're looking at that disparity of like 139 Black farmers in all of New York State, when there's 57,000 farmers in New York State, right? And we're turning away over 200 aspiring Black and Indigenous and Brown farmers every year, we can see that there's a lack of investment here that needs to be dealt with, right? And we're not alone in this. We are one of many Black and BIPOC-led training programs here in New York State that are flooded with applications, and we're not really able to train and mentor all of the people who are coming to us. And they're looking to us because we provide safe spaces that are grounded in Black agrarianism and Black food sovereignty to help folks really build collective wealth and community. So what is the problem here? What is this problem? It really is a lack of investment. There are many, many barriers, one being a lack of investment in training, lack of access to land, lack of networking support, and capital investment for aspiring and beginning BIPOC farmers. And that investment really needs to meet beginning Black farmers where they are. And in New York State, that is in cities. So we have the second largest Black population of any state in the nation in New York State. 93% of all Black people in New York State actually live in New York City and its surrounding areas. We are primarily an urban population as Black people, and similar things can be said, not quite as stark statistics around Latinx folks. And so when we're looking at cities, that is really where Black people farm primarily. And if you're undercounting and underinvesting in urban agriculture, in our state at least, this is clearly a racial justice issue as well. Food sovereignty in our cities really must be grounded in community-based urban agriculture. And I really appreciate what you're saying, Heather, about that locality and how bringing our food systems more local creates more sovereignty and more voice for the people we're serving. That is very much the case for Black communities. And again, that means we need to look at these urban areas where we live. Our small urban farms in our cities grow nutritious foods for our families, our communities. They are a big provider for emergency food sites in our cities. They are centers of learning and recreation. They deliver innumerable environmental benefits. They reduce city heat. They decrease stormwater runoff, which is a big issue in our system. They create safer soil, natural habitat for pollinators, and they are also economic engines. Small farms aggregate produce. They create really dynamite value-added products, and they're actually often buying from both urban and rural farmers to create those products. And they just really create bustling markets and a vibrant culture in our cities. So this is very true for urban ag, and I also want to say that there's a growing segment of Farm School NYC graduates and other folks that are doing urban farm training programs that go on to larger scale farming. They have an intention to do that, and increasingly they are doing more and more of that. And so our students recognize this urban to rural continuum, and that's a vital part of our food system here in New York City, New York State. So again, if we're training people in cities where they currently live and work, it allows that opportunity to really support themselves while they're learning. Sometimes it's really hard to do farmer training programs in a more rural context. That's actually what I did. And I couldn't work for an entire year, and I still had to pay rent in New York City while I was living in California. That is inaccessible for many people who don't have the privilege of having additional income and family support to do things like that. So it's really important to fund this in urban centers. I want to also really link in, because I'm worried about time, some of the organizing that we've been doing on a state level. And so we looked at these real issues around land access, access to capital, access to training that we were experiencing here in the city context, and began speaking more and more with our rural counterparts, folks that were doing organizing around Black farmers and food systems in other urban areas across New York State and also in rural areas. And we saw so many of the same types of barriers and also the same types of solutions that we found were working for our folks. And coming together, we decided to found an organization called Black Farmers United New York State. And Black Farmers United New York State really is a group of over 100 Black farmers, educators, and food justice advocates. We come together and we envision a future where every Black person who's called to farm is a joyful and thriving farmer, that we're building collective power and generational wealth and fertile, abundant land and healthy, equitable communities throughout New York State. Together, we created a platform of 9 solutions for racial equity in New York State agriculture. I will drop a link to that once I stop talking so that you can see what this platform looks like. It was written by about 20 of our original members, and it includes 9 different steps that meet those barriers that I talked with you about before, in particular access to capital and ways that we can have community decision-making and autonomy around that capital. That's why, Heather, when I hear you speaking, I'm like, oh, we must learn from all of the different strategies that you came forward with. We know what we need and what we want, and we want to replicate some of the success that you've had in the state legislature in Maine as we're going and advocating for ourselves here in New York State's legislature. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'm very excited to hear more from the other panelists and to hear questions and be in dialogue a bit later. So thank you.
Thank you. What a wonderful insight into another whole range of activism and advocacy. And I must say, as someone who comes from generations of farmers, always out in the country, it's inspiring and almost unbelievable to me how what an enormous resource urban agriculture is, and how extremely important in terms of food security, food sovereignty, and appropriate food. So thank you. I'm sure there'll be more discussion about this. We move on now to our next speaker, Monica Castillo, who is a member of Mexico's National Union of Autonomous Regional Peasant Organizations, UNORCA, a network of Mexican campesino and indigenous farming organizations advocating for small farmers' livelihoods and rights. She's also a member of the Youth Articulation of La Villa Campesina North America. Within these organizing spaces, Monica has years of advocacy experience fighting for climate justice, farmer and peasant rights, and food sovereignty. Monica, and those of us who are English speakers, we have interpretation. Let me just remind you. Monica.
Hola, muy buenas tardes.
Hi, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be in this space. I'm happy to share a little bit about what we're doing and how we're working. How Nattie just said, thank you so much. for this beautiful presentation. I'm Monica. I'm from Mexico. I'm part of NORCA, the National Regional Organization of Autonomous Farm Workers.
The fight for food sovereignty has been one of UNORCA main fights, and terms also to provide for local food system, and also to respect the environment of our local and regional locations, at the same time that improving the economic benefit of its peasants, and at the same time to maintain our organization strong. We are against mining and other extractive industries that damage our environment. In some cases, the way in which the licenses have been given to these corporations has been not in the right way, and they have been damaged the communities. Congress has passed a few laws that have been without the consult or without the input from the communities. And many of them do not include regulations in terms of improving rifles. Among other activities that we do for food sovereignty is the way in which we produce the food and the right to produce food.
Esta palabra ha sido una palabra de mucha resistencia.
And in our food sovereignty has been a little bit controversial in some sectors of the political spectrum, has been debatable. There is a sector of the population that do not understand that part. And it has been a fight and resistance, but it's a term that is very key for us. And all the different aspects that we have been doing and of the implementation for this process, we have been doing also the local production on areas, in urban areas, even some local production at the household level. Many families have room on their houses where they can produce a combination of animals.
Dentro de estas mismas cuestiones tenemos algunas ferias bueno, le llamamos mercados locales, pero son ferias en donde llevamos algunas mermeladas, algunos quesos, algunas artesanías que son propiamente también para que la gente pueda tener un poco de ingreso, y pues algunas otras ventas de hortalizas que nosotros propiamente producimos. A nivel nacional, la UNORCA está trabajando también dentro del Consejo Nacional Mexicano, tiene un espacio, ahí quiero hablar un poquito acerca de las comisiones con las que nos relacionamos más, que son las comisiones de financiamiento y presupuesto, la Comisión de Seguridad Alimentaria, que es en donde hemos tenido actualmente una amplia participación, la de Trabajo Legislativo y la Comisión de Mercados. Les hablaba un poquito acerca de lo que para nosotros es soberanía alimentaria y cómo queremos trabajarla dentro de la Comisión de Seguridad Alimentaria. Estamos trabajando en una propuesta
Right to food, and we are working on a public policy that can help how through planning on the state. So there is also an evaluation of how much is consumed and how much is produced. It is not about how we want to farm or what we want to farm, but we think that it's important to know what we farm so we don't have overproduction and impact the prices of what we produce. Supply management. If we are if we have food sovereignty at the regional level, we can get to a national food sovereignty as well. We want to implement agroecology as a model. One issue that we have severely faced in Mexico is the people that buy the produce directly to producers and then bring it to the market. And this intermediation, these people that is in between the producers and the consumers, increase the prices and reduce the income for small farmers. We want to have this kind of analysis. We have a small group that has been working. They call the Siervos de la Nación that are more interesting or more engaged in what is the work that is being done. And also, we want the and then we need to see that the food that we produce is healthy, that is diverse, that it is affordable for the families, and at some point we would like to have some overproduction that we can storage, or we can save, or we can process for the future. To have a supply management on the production, we can manage the levels of production. On the Commission of Legislative Work, we are trying to work with Congress to have this vinculation of this process in which we can leverage the adoption of UNDROP at the national constitutional level, which is a process in which we can modify Article 27, that is the article that regulates the agricultural sector. I think that we have been advanced, and this has been one of our objectives. One of the work that we have is to make diffusion and education with the different sectors of the population so they know the rights of the peasants. And that's one of our main objectives right now. And this is, whole process needs to go by hand. And this is something that we are going to propose today in the national level. Many peasant organizations are meeting today, and this is the proposal that we are going to have. It's over 100 organizations that are part of this National Congress of Peasants. And we will try to promote agroecology in that space. And I'm going to end there, and I hope that if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Monica. Wide-ranging and very important intervention there. Without further ado,
muy importante.
I am going to
Muchas gracias, Mónica.
and introduce him by saying, first of all, that he is sacrificing a night's sleep to be with us. It's after midnight for him, and we owe him a huge thanks for being awake and look forward to what he has to say. It's Indra Shakar Singh, who writes on agriculture and environment and is the former director of the Policy and Outreach National Seed Association of India. His work has been published in a wide variety of media outlets, including Civil Eats, The Wire, First Post, and many more. Indra is the host and creator of The Wire's Krisha Ki Bahat, Farm Talks, a show featuring farmer experiences from across India and abroad, and including topics such as agroecology, corporate domination, and parity pricing. Welcome, Indra.
Thank you very much. And I think my story begins, one small part is that I've spent the last 2 years working with the farmers, within the farmers camps. And that's why I take this opportunity to bring their message to all of you. Now, for a few centuries now, corporations have run the world, whether it be the British East India Corporation to Exxon, to Monsanto, Bayer, and all these big agri-giants like Cargill, who actually control hunger in the world. Now, what happens is when you get so much power, sometimes you get complacent. And that's what they did when they thought that they could dismantle price floors for agricultural commodities, for grain reserves in India. They thought that with the same corporate power and tyranny, they can take over India's agriculture. Indian agriculture is, in a nutshell, what you would imagine is the agriculture of America between 1920 to 1950. That's what the mentality is. A major part of our population is in agriculture. There is overproduction, there is low prices. So similar problems. I'm not saying it's the same, but a similar kind of setting, right? And hence we still have an MSP program, which is the minimum support price program, which is just what America had in terms of your price floors and parity price. We still have government grain reserves, which are used to basically, get the prices down when there's high inflation. And along with that, we have some additional safeguards, like no private processor can hoard beyond a certain limit of grain, so that there's no hoarding in the market. So in that way, Indian farmers were protected after India got independence, and the corporations wanted to dismantle all of this. They said that we will not have price floors because we've already dismantled that in America. Let's try the same experiment here. Let's use the same MO. But there they were wrong. They used the Indian government, and they said that through a diktat, almost like an emperor announcing in the taking coronavirus lockdowns as a guise, they said that, hey, we are going to have change India's agriculture with one order. And they introduced 3 farm laws. And the Indian farmers said, no, we are not doing this. They risked their lives, and 10 million of them started to march towards Delhi's borders. This was the world's biggest Occupy movement. This was, in fact, the world's biggest movement of any kind ever. When you have 10 million farmers who are spending 13 months on the roads of Delhi, occupying 3 arterial roads of Delhi and camping there, creating cities made with plastic, wood, whatever they can find. And they are doing non-violent resistance. They're singing their songs, they're talking about revolution, they're actually creating a gift economy. And this is what the corporations were deeply threatened by. In a period of 13 months, the Modi government had to repeal the 3 laws that allowed for corporatization of Indian agriculture. And then started, I think, another major demand, which is not only going to change the fate of Indian farmers, but farmers maybe all over the world. It was a demand to make price floors or parity price as a legal right for farmers. Keep in mind that Indian farmers have very small holdings. We have many of our farming families don't even own 1 acre. So imagine a 1 acre farmer. What kind of bargaining chip will that have, or they would have, against a Cargill of the world, against a Walmart? None at all. So the Indian farmer revolution, which ended in a major victory as the laws were repealed, they said that we need to actually ask people from all over the world, and also at the WTO, also at the Indian government, that why can't every farmer be guaranteed a price for their produce? No one is saying this is the maximum price a farmer can get. Let this be the minimum, that no grain which is sold no grain should be sold below this number, right? And that's how you can ensure that the corporate manipulators do not manipulate the farmers. That's the way we bring agroeconomic justice to some of the poorest people in the world. Indian farmers don't even earn $88 a year in profits. That's how bad agriculture is here because of many structural problems, corruption, and other policy like wrong policy and bad policy initiatives. So that's where we are. And why this message is important, because after this modern technology, modern age, globalization, the MSP program, people think that it's an Indian design or minimum support idea. No, it came from the US. And as US is debating the farm bill and other initiatives, it is important that once again the government actually reaches out to support not the big corporations, not the big banks supporting the farmers, but actually that 1% farmers and new people who want to enter farming. Because when new people, young people like myself, they want to enter farming, many times they don't know anything about it. They get cheated by people who are trying to buy things from them. So if the government can bring about an issue or some kind of a law, ordinance, or some kind of understanding, I think this will be the greatest step, no matter whether the American government does it or the Indian government does it. It will be the biggest step to ensure that the dignity of the rural community is maintained. We made a movie with the American university, which went into the hinterlands of Iowa, and it talked to farmers. It actually, people, you should watch it on the website, which talks about how with the erosion of parity price, the economies just disappeared too. People were just destitute after that. The towns became ghost towns. And that's exactly where India is also being pushed at. Of course, the American situation is very different from the Indian one. But it's the same people, surprisingly, who are attacking the American farmer, looting from the north, from farmers in Mexico, from Brazil. And it's the same people who are trying to attack and take control and profit from our agriculture too. It's the same Monsanto's killing farmers in Mexico and killing farmers in India. So it's the same link. And I think if there is, and the webinar is also dedicated to it, we must think of how a world parity price, if possible, in some degree or some relative notion of world parity price, is the only way we can win against the corporations. Because most of the grain they control the trade routes, they control the ships, they control hunger. I think that's what I think. Cargill controls hunger in the world today, especially after the Ukraine-Russia fallout. So why not farmers of the world combine in a transnational understanding of parity price for everybody? Of course, American standard of living is much different from Indian standard of living, the costs. So why can't we have some kind of a national formula which gives dignity to farmers and not subsidies to corporations? I think my 10 minutes are up now, but thank you for listening. And if there are any more questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Indra. What a passionate, and I must say from those of us elsewhere in the world, an inspiring example of how mass resistance was effective in India. So thank you for sharing that with us, and I'm sure there'll be questions about that. I'm just going to attempt a very quick overview of what we've had. As I promised at the beginning, it has been a diverse and an excellent panel. And I must say that the framework of food sovereignty, it resonates throughout all of these pieces, whether it's at the international, national, regional, local, on-farm, in-city level. At all these levels, the umbrella concept of food sovereignty, which the Via Campesina put onto the agenda in 1996 in Mexico, actually, at our Tlaxcala Congress. It serves us well in terms of allowing us both the space and the diversity to actually consider what's happening in our food systems, at our tables, in our neighborhoods, and in the larger picture. When we first started the Via Campesina to advocate for food sovereignty, it was in the context of what Indra has spoken to, which was the transnational corporate agenda, buoyed by trade agreements, at that time the GATT-WTO, which served to undermine local control, regional control over food systems, over food producing resources, and therewith concentrated both wealth, power, and enormous resources in the food systems in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And let me just remind you of our topic here, which is reclaiming democratic control. When you have such resources and such power concentrated in so few boardrooms, it's an affront. It undermines, it decimates democracy. Because people who cannot decide about what they will eat, what they will produce, and take care of the environments, the food producing environments, are people who are disenfranchised in a fundamental way. Whether you have a voting system for representatives or not, it is anti-democratic to have that kind of power and control in what is an essential human right, which is eating, the right to food. So these talks, and they've been wonderful. I've been taking notes. I will not in any way try to replicate all of the wonderful information and inspiration we've heard here. But these talks, again, I think, open the door for us to think collectively and to rethink where we are in the food systems and what's possible to begin to erase the huge disparities, to move to greater parity, not just parity in pricing, which is how it's usually interpreted, but parity in control, in power in the food system, and parity of food producing resources, and how we move to that. So I won't take any more time because we have questions, and I'm anxious to ensure that the participants in this webinar get to have conversations with these wonderful speakers, and also, of course, that you who are presenters can exchange information and ask each other, engage in conversation with each other. So let us just move here to the questions. And I'm going to need some guidance here. There are many, many questions, so I'm going to need some guidance as to where to begin. But I'll begin perhaps with the first question that was posed, which is, and I'll have to read these questions to you. Oh my goodness.
Nettie, we through some of the questions that we've been kind of collecting them and combining them in the chat. So I just sent you one that we thought might be a good place to start, and then I will continue to feed them to you personally.
Thank you for that guidance. Much appreciated. So I'm looking at the top of the screen here, and it's a question from Maddie Kempter, which is, thank you, Heather. We've long talked about trying to replicate something like Maine's food sovereignty law in Vermont. In Vermont, sorry. I'm not from the States, obviously. Do you have insight or advice for how similar policies can be passed in states like ours that don't have home rule? So this is for you, Heather.
Okay, thank you, Nettie. Yeah, that is a great question. If you don't have home rule, you probably have Dillon's law. And even though you can't pass binding law at the local level, you can't actually adopt ordinances. You can pass resolutions. They're non-binding, but they at least articulate the food sovereignty principles. They articulate what you need in your community, and they can be utilized in a similar way of building that kind of horizontal policy diffusion, and shifting the conversation. So some of these concepts that we've heard today, you know, going all the way up to like, what is a small farm in Maine or a 1 acre farmer in India have against Cargill or Purdue or any of these monolithic corporations, and the seeds we haven't even talked about. But you can build it at the local level through resolutions in Vermont. West Virginia has a great example of that. And I can't remember the name of the city right now, but in West Virginia, they recently passed a right to food resolution to shift that conversation in their state. And in 2011, I believe it was, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I think Barry, Vermont, adopted a resolution resonant on some of the themes of our local ordinances. So you can still go that route.
Thank you, Heather. Question is, did being part of these organic farmers organizations help in building their missions and education, and how? So this is really a question about how does this the organization of organic farmers and associations feed into these policy initiatives? Does it help? How does this work? So this is for Heather and for Liz. No, this is for Onika and for Liz. Sorry about that.
Onika, you want to go first?
Liz, you're the one who got me on NOFA's board, so I feel like you should answer first.
Well, the NOFAs just celebrated their 50th anniversary last year, so we're 51 years old. And from the beginning, what the NOFAs have tried to do is to build a network of people who would teach one another how to grow food using agroecological methods, spread that information freely with one another, and build local markets so that we could follow the teachings of Booker T. Whatley, who said, "Shun middlemen and women like the plague." So that's been just part of what we have done all along, to build local food sovereignty in that way. We didn't have the phrase food sovereignty when we started, and it took a while for our brains to kind of figure out that, hey, that's what we're doing. We had called it local self-reliance and community interdependence. So that's very much what the NOFAs have been about. And the next issue of our regional newspaper, The Natural Farmer, which will be coming out in the next 2 weeks, is devoted to countering corporate capture. So I recommend it to you all. Onika.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you so much for that framing, Liz, and for introducing me to NOFA New York. So I did serve on the board for a season, for a term, and I think I loved the fact that there was a real synergy of purpose with NOFA and the interactions I had there as an individual, and the ways that I was able to sort of feed information I was learning at NOFA conferences to the folks I was working with downstate in New York City, and vice versa. So certainly we benefited from some of the technical approaches that we learned at NOFA conferences. There's a really big, lovely conference, at least one, sometimes two, that happens in New York State as a result of NOFA. And we always would learn a lot from all of the different examples and templates and the different learnings that were shared at the conferences, and would bring that back. I think what we were able to contribute is we would often put on different types of workshops that were really bringing that social justice aspect that we feel is a key part of agroecology and the original framing of agroecology, and is sometimes forgotten by some folks. When they hear the word organic, they might just think of the label as opposed to the movement. And so I think that we were able to elevate those conversations, especially from our perspective as BIPOC folks working in New York City.
Yeah, and one of my themes at NOFA meetings has been for many, many years that NOFA New York will not achieve our goals of transforming the food system in New York State to being fully agroecological until our membership looks like the membership of this state and of New York City.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm seeing a whole lot of questions in the chat, but let me just say that I see a question here that is for all of you, which is now let me just find it here. How does the trade? I haven't got it right in front of me. Well, how does the trade agenda intersect with or interact with the principles of food sovereignty? How does food sovereignty interact with principles of free trade? I think I said at the outset that the whole emergence of the concept, the umbrella concept of food sovereignty, emerged out of our peasant small-scale farmer resistance to the GATT, the WTO, the corporatization, globalization of agricultural trade. And since then, food sovereignty has always been challenged with, so how do you hold both food sovereignty principles, but also allow for trade? So that's the context of the question. Maybe we'll start with Indra on this one.
Hello. Yeah. So trade and food sovereignty, right? So see, if we in the parity context, if you begin there, like we look at how parity program was eroded in America. I think this was one of the principal arguments that was used to say that this is not happening. We're getting too many surpluses. The corporations are not making enough money. I think so. Just if we understand that case example, we have to understand that it's the same people using the same, like there are levels of development in across the world in terms of agriculture. The highest corporatized and the lowest corporatized. Countries like India actually are somewhere in the middle, whereas countries like America are on the supreme end. And when we look at examples like America, we see that the food sovereignty movement is perhaps at its weakest because there are 1% farmers in America.
Pero, sin embargo, hay
the four corporations for their meat, for their cheese, for their milk, for their pork, everything. So wherever you are in the kind of corporate that corporate saturation level, I think that defines how much food sovereign can you be. Now, our dear panelists from Mexico talking about the Via Campesinas. See, that's where I think that's also a middle country, where there is a fight which is on between the farmers who want food sovereignty and they are trying to do their local thing, cultivate their own gardens, and people who are interested in like hardcore trade, the corporate minds, right? Somehow people are always fighting. Because if the food sovereignty trade model wins, which is basically of cooperation, sharing, and the fair price model, the corporate dominoes will fall in 1 second. That I think that's how I see that, and that's why the corporations will never make it happen. If you look at some of the private lives of the 5 biggest grain companies, we find they are highly secretive, highly corporatized, highly corporatized. And they are the ones who are making profits from it. They are the ones deciding food policies of countries, how to break through food sovereignty measures. And that's why the Indian Farmer Revolution was actually an attempt by companies like Cargill. And the movie, which is, I think, listed here and the link is there, that directly talks about it. that why were they interested in to break Indian food sovereignty? Because every time you dismantle a system, there is a whole lot of corporate profit that you can get out of it. You're stealing from the people's autonomy, and that has a value for these corporations. So, of course, I do not know that model, but I think if I were to imagine a utopic model where food sovereignty and trade would also work, it's a Gandhian model, which talks about farmers first growing as per their agroclimatic zones, growing as per what their community needs. For example, if America eats a lot of cheese and meat, well, there should be regenerative ranchers and regenerative people who grow the vegetables that you like, right? And if, for example, if there are farmers in India, they should be growing to our taste and palate. Not we don't have to ship food from million miles away to your table and million miles away back to my table. You see? So I think a good trade model would be to build upon our strengths, build upon things that we can really do well, and have fair price at one place and a cooperative model, which is somehow still alive in India. In some like dying phase, it's still alive and it's still working. So I think that's a model with the numbers. We can balance trade and we can balance food sovereignty. Without it, we see already what's happened to America. We already see what's happened to Canada. The same will happen to all of us eventually if we don't resist and don't actually make these clusters. So hope I was able to answer the question. Maybe yes, maybe no.
Thank you. Liz or someone else want to speak to that one also? Monica? Heather.
Yeah, just to sort of come in on part of what Indra was saying, and in terms of the whole picture in the United States and food sovereignty. I was able years ago to go to a food sovereignty summit, which was so fascinating because, of course, food sovereignty was being brought forward by so many people from India, so many people from Brazil. And as we were able to interact with each other, you know, as peasants from all across the world, and seeing what we had in common, also there was great surprise because isn't food sovereignty already dead? Isn't it already, you know, ready to be buried in America? And Maine may share something in common, I think, with India, and I feel like it has something to do with why we were able to still do what we did here. And why it's maybe more difficult in more urban places. Maine, we have a very sparse population and we're very spread apart. We only have 1.2 million people in the whole state, but rural homesteading skills, self-sufficiency skills, the ability to grow food, the knowledge about how to grow food and process it is still part of our cultural foodway, our traditional foodways. And so here people still have that to protect, and that passion about protecting what we do still have if we don't want it all to come from across the world or from the supermarket, that knowledge was still there. And I think that's why what Anika was talking about in New York City is so powerful as well, is giving everybody, passing on those skills and that knowledge then reanimates this necessity of creating a legal space around it where it can continue and thrive.
Thank you. Thank you indeed for emphasizing something. When we talk about investment and resources, we often just talk about the financial, but it is also, of course, the nature and the knowledge of food systems that are major benefits, and knowing that, having that is important. Our next question is, what are your stances on organic versus GMO food production? And specifically to Monica, what is your position on the new initiative in Mexico to limit the use of pesticides such as glyphosate? And the second part of that question is to Indra. Can you speak about the tension between organic methods and chemical company inputs in India? Are farmers also focused on promoting regenerative farming? So these are several components. I'll turn to you first, Monica.
Bueno, antes que nada,
before saying something beyond talking about the position of Inorca of the end of the glyphosate, it is being a flag of fight for UNORCA. For many, many years, UNORCA has been committed to end the agrochemicals, particularly glyphosates. This is not something new, and recently the Senate passed the elimination of glyphosate. I think our position is that we need to look for the way in which we can really see the end of glyphosate. Now, we are concerned, or we need to see in the process in which the glyphosate is going to be phased out. We can expect that glyphosate is going to be banned from one day to the other. Glyphosate is being eliminated in many other places in the world. And obviously, we need to see how the production is not suffering. Right now, this is not a position of UNORCA by itself. Many communities are trying to ban glyphosate, but we would like to see it in a meaningful way, or in a process in which it's not going to impact producers. It is being so embedded into the process or into the model that we farm. Many people is using glyphosate, so we need to see how it's going to be implemented at the national level, even at the international level.
So I'll just add to that, like India just banned glyphosate after people's petitioning the government to ban glyphosate. So that's also one of the big achievements we've had in India. And currently we are debating the introduction of the first GM crop in India, which is the GM mustard, or the West knows it as GM canola. Okay, so there's a big debate happening here. And that's how I'll get to the question between organic methods and the chemical companies. So Indian agriculture, keep in mind, whatever is happening with the chemical companies, it's polluting our lands, polluting our waters. It's come to such a point that there is a state in India where people's blood have pesticides in them in huge quantities. There are cancer trains. People with cancers don't have enough money to go to private hospitals. So they go to these charity hospitals in the neighboring state just because of all the chemicals that was sprayed on their land and water systems. American corporations, sadly, have been instrumental, whether they be the Union Carbide Corporation, and alike, have been instrumental in pushing these chemicals as part of government policy upon us. It's, we understand this as a scientific racism, where you think that the agronomy of the Western scientists is right, and the indigenous knowledge and the indigenous ways that we farmed and grown up is wrong. And that's the mentality today which is practiced by the dominant agricultural policymakers. They think that whatever comes from the West is great and our own things are bad. And that's where the Indian farmer is caught between. If you're too poor to buy chemicals, you're naturally organic. But otherwise, the government is pushing you towards chemicals, offering you subsidies, and not subsidies to you, but subsidies to the chemical makers so that they can push more chemicals on the Indian market. India is a place with 1.4 billion people, 600 million of them involved in agriculture. So in effect, you're just toxifying your own population. It's a very deep kind of eugenics if you think about it, because cancer rates in this country are just booming, especially in the rural belts. Food style related diseases, kidney trouble, people's kidney failing in the remotest paradise. You don't know why. It's never happened in villages before that young children, teenagers are getting cancer. And I think that's the malicious intent of everyone together. So organic farmers are fighting. And currently what's happened is that the government, being pressurized, has accepted that there should be a national policy on organic farming. The government, because of the agri dollars that organic produce brings, they want to encourage organic farming in certain areas. But the debate is still on. People still think it's hocus pocus, pagan, whatever ways of agriculture. But the truth is that the soul and heart of India still farms organically. If you ask anybody, they understand that they're spraying toxins on their land, but they know it's wrong, but they do it for money. But at least the land ethic is not gone. At least they are like somewhat guilty. And then you'll find militant people who understand the land as their mother, and they'll never spray something wrong on it because they think it's foreign and it's not suited for the land. So there is this dichotomy which is there, and I hope I was able to answer the question. Yeah.
Thank you. We have perhaps room for one final question, which is, what was the political experience in Maine, and of all of you in the US-based work, what lessons might it have for the Farm Bill and beyond? This is a very much a US-based question, but it has to do with how one does policy work. Heather, I'll start with you there.
Yeah, maybe I can tie it in a little bit to the international work as well. Just in terms of, I think when you're maybe asking about political experience, you're wondering about the political parties and how did the different parties interpret what we were doing? How did we get them all on board? And in a way, I think it ties into a little bit about what Indra was talking about, is that it's not necessarily, and this was our fundamental understanding moving forward, our opposition wasn't going to come necessarily from either political party, but it was going to come from industrialists. It was going to come from chemical agriculture, working through those parties if they could get messages through. And so we always understood that to be our opposition, and that to be what we were working to build something outside of that structure, something completely autonomous from it, because we couldn't have a voice within that structure. So when we went into communities and also into the State House, we didn't talk about anything except for the issues. The three questions that we were fundamentally trying to answer at the local level was: who decides? What relationships do we want to have with each other in our own community? And what rights do we want to encode into law? And so we worked up from there. And I will tell you, I think I saw one question about somebody asking about libertarianism. Certainly there are parts of our work that really have resonant strains for libertarians. The champion in the State House considers himself a democratic libertarian. But also our board president, Food for Maine's Future, loves to talk about, Betsy Garrett loves to talk about how oftentimes this was where rednecks and hippies could join forces. And it absolutely was. Food is common ground. We all don't want chemicals in our bodies. We all want to nurture what makes sense in our communities. And so we really focused on the relationships of trust and respect, and that fundamentally when we're talking about food sovereignty, when we're talking about democracy and food, we're talking about where are we placing our trust and who gets to decide where we place our trust. And if we can't define ourselves, then we don't get to make those decisions. So we needed to take back that language, the control of the language first. And then also it was going to protect the social networks that were built on trust and care and respect, and are being fostered through the exchanges, these direct exchanges of food, and keeping this community-based model going. And that's something that resonated across parties. So in the last iteration of the right to food in our State House, it was sponsored by a Libertarian Republican who came to the House and said, when our Senator Hickman, the Democrat, was going to be terming out, the Libertarian Billy Bob Falkingham was going to take this work forward. So we worked with everybody and against that kind of corporate industrial model, and against party leaderships in both parties, actually.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive and answer, which ties it nicely together, that it's about taking back the language, which food sovereignty is our language. It's about understanding what the power relations are and working with everybody who is prepared to recapture and, let me say, heal the food systems again. So that's, I think, a very comprehensive answer. Thank you, Heather. And I now have to say goodbye as your facilitator and introduce Nayaz Dori from NFFC and NAMA to do a final piece here. Nayaz.
Thank you, Nettie, and thank you, Indra and Monica and Onika and Heather and everyone and Liz and others who contribute to this. I have the honor of serving National Family Farm Coalition and also North American Marine Alliance, working very closely with farmers, ranchers, and fishing people across this continent, but also through associations around the world. So it's really nice to hear hyper-local and hyper-global stories here that are really woven through with the theme of self-determination, food sovereignty, the right to determine how you're going to live, where you're going to farm, what you're going to eat, and most importantly, when it comes to parity, whether or not you are compensated for what you're worth. And that, to me, was one of the issues that when I first attended National Family Farm Coalition board meetings many, many years ago, I struggled with the concept of parity. I didn't understand it, mostly because when I heard it from the farmers, it immediately went to the concept of parity as a policy from way back, as opposed to some of the stories we heard here, that parity is more than that. And it wasn't until I realized parity is the opposite of disparity that I really began to understand the broader implications of having policies that advocate for parity and social movements that push for parity. This project started a couple of years ago, really was seeded by the wisdom of the many farmers that have taught me and many of us about what it means to achieve parity, what it means to live in disparity. And then Garrett from American University really jump-started this project by suggesting that we all come together and pool our intellectual resources together to come up with a way to achieve what was done for me personally, which is to untangle what it means, what parity means, and see if we can do that for a broader public and for the broader farming, food providing, fishing and ranching community as well. COVID happened, as we all know, so we all went to this virtual space. And over the past to almost 3 years, these webinars have really given us the opportunity to bring those issues to the eyes and ears of many of you who have attended these gatherings. The essays that have been written by farmers and academics and activists that are hosted on the Disparity to Parity website really allow us to go even deeper into some of these topics. If you haven't yet visited the website, I encourage you to do that, disparitytoparity.org. There's also some really powerful videos that have been created that are also on the website, not only the recordings of these webinars, but also 4 short films. And another film that will be coming up that Indra already talked about a little bit. So keep an eye out for that. And that'll be coming down the pike. I want to take this opportunity to thank a lot of folks who have played a really important part in this. And to start with, as I mentioned, the American University, by providing us with this space, the virtual space, but also the idea that sparked this whole project. Garrett, Kate Arian from American University and others who helped us with the technological elements of these webinars. Speaking of technology, I need to thank Grace Communications Foundation, whose pro bono support helped build the website and the online presence that we have. This project has been empowered by a group of that we call the editorial team or the planning team, Liz Henderson amongst them, our board president, Jim Goodman, Catherine Anderson, and many more. Jahi Chappelle was with us for a bit as part of the editorial team. And of course, our team at NFFC, which includes Sam and Meg, who you heard from today, Antonio, who helped with translation today, Jordan, International Program Coordinator, and Lisa Griffith, who would be with us here today, except she's on sabbatical, a much needed rest until the beginning of the year. And I think for me, I want to also make sure that I want to thank all the folks like the Nailers and Brad Wilson and others who just kept hammering this concept of parity into my head. And I think it took traveling across the country in 2018 to really recognize that the concept of parity brings about the kind of social peace that we're all craving. And so that's one of the essays that I wrote on there, is about parity equals peace. And I want to leave us with that message, because as Indra mentioned, as Monica mentioned, Heather and others have mentioned, Anika mentioned, really at the heart of all of this idea of being recognized for what you're doing, being able to eat what your DNA is seeking, being able to live in places where you're nurtured by the soil, by the air, by the fish, by the food that's grown, it really brings about the kind of peace we all crave. And we've already recognized that in rural communities where not being recognized for your worth, we're seeing the kind of uprising that we've experienced over the last few years here in the US, in India, and elsewhere. So I hope we take away, if nothing else, from these series and this project, that achieving this sort of social change, this kind of policy change, really brings about the kind of thing we all seek, which is peace in our communities, peace in our homes, and peace across the country and across the nation and across the globe. And I want to thank all of you who have played a key part in making this happen, and I look forward to further collaboration with you. Please keep an eye out on the website for new essays, for more videos, and keep an eye out for all of our partners announcing further opportunities for action. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a good rest of this year.